Welcome, believers. Today we are going to be talking about the J'ba Fofi, the giant spider of the Congo. Imagine driving through the Congo rainforest. There is no traffic, no streetlights, no buildings, no sound of civilization, only trees. Thousands upon thousands of trees. The road ahead is little more than a track through the jungle. Then something moves. You can see it in your peripheral vision. It emerges from the vegetation. At first you can't make out what you're seeing. A strange animal, perhaps. A monkey? A cat? Something crosses the road and you slow down. The jeep rattles. Then you realise it's a spider. But not the kind of spider you find hiding in your shed, oh no. Not even the kind of spider you would normally describe as enormous. This spider is several feet across. 8 long legs stretch across the road. A huge hairy body moves slowly between them, and for a few seconds you simply stare. Then the creature disappears into the forest. No photograph, no body, no scientific specimen, only a story. A story that has survived for generations, and this creature is known as the J'ba Fofi, the giant spider of the Congo. And today, on this episode of UFOs, Aliens and Weird Stuff, we're going into the forest to find out whether there could really be something hiding there. The Congo Basin is one of the great wildernesses of our planet. It is an environment where visibility can be extremely limited. Dense vegetation covers the ground. Trees block the sunlight, and the forest floor can become a maze of roots, leaves, vines and shadows. For people who live within the environment, the forest isn't simply wilderness. It is a home. The Baka people of Central Africa have an extensive traditional knowledge of the forest and its wildlife. You should believe what they tell you. And with an account attributed to Baka informants, it's a creature described as a great or giant spider. Now, the name commonly given to it is J'ba Fofi. The descriptions are extraordinary. A large brown tarantula-like animal. Some accounts describe a purple marking on its abdomen. Some describe enormous webs. Others describe concealed shelters constructed from leaves, almost like miniature huts. The spiders are said to hunt along animal trails, using strands of webbing or trip lines to detect or trap prey. Now, some accounts even claim that the creature can take birds and small forest animals. These descriptions come from later researchers and cryptozoological literature rather than a zoological survey. And that distinction is extremely important because there is a difference between documenting a traditional account, okay, and documenting a new animal species. And at the moment, the J'ba Fofi belongs firmly in the first category. But then we come to the eyewitnesses. Now, the most famous Western account allegedly took place in 1938. The witnesses were Reginald and Margurite Lloyd, so the Lloyds. According to later accounts, the couple were travelling by vehicle along a jungle track when something emerged from the vegetation and crossed their path. Now, at first, they couldn't identify it. The creature was large enough to be mistaken for something else. A cat, a monkey, perhaps another animal. Then they realised that they were looking at a spider, an enormous spider. Now, later versions of the story have given different measurements. Some accounts say approximately 3 foot across. Others have repeated estimates closer to 5. Now, that inconsistency is important, isn't it? Because the original encounter was not accompanied by scientific measurement. Because let's face it, the Lloyds did not jump out their van, run into the woods with a tape measure to measure it. It was an eyewitness estimate. And eyewitnesses are notoriously poor at judging the size of unfamiliar objects, particularly when there is nothing nearby to provide a reliable scale. But let's face it, right? The Lloyds said they saw a massive, enormous spider. That they know what they saw. But there is another detail that's made this story famous. The Lloyds reportedly tried to obtain a photograph, but they couldn't. The spider disappeared into the vegetation, and that was it, right? The creature was gone. So, no photograph, no specimen, no evidence left behind, only the account. Now, the story apparently eventually became widely repeated in cryptozoological literature, including George Eberhardt's reference work on mysterious creatures. So it got out there. And this is where the J'ba Fofi mystery could have ended. One strange story, one alleged sighting, a forgotten jungle encounter, but it didn't. Right? Decades later, researcher William J. Gibbons was investigating mysterious creatures in Central Africa. Now, his primary interest was not the J'ba Fofi. He was investigating another famous cryptoid, the legendary Mokele Mbembe, right? A water-dwelling entity that supposedly lived in the Congo River Basin. Right, so this bloke, William J. Gibbons, went to the Congo to investigate something entirely different. Right, but during his conversations with the Baka people in Cameroon, the subject of enormous spiders came up, and suddenly the 1938 story wasn't alone anymore. According to accounts of Gibbons' research, Baka informants described the J'ba Fofi as a very large forest spider. They reportedly described it as brown, sometimes with a purple abdomen, very much like the 1938 incident. They described concealed shelters, constructions from leaves. They described webs between trees, and they described strands crossing animal trails. Right, but most interestingly, they reported saying that these spiders were once much more common. Right, by the early 2000s, they had become rare. The claim could have been interpreted as nothing more than folklore, of course, until one particular conversation. Now, I always say, listen to the Baka people. All right, they live in the Congo. They live there. That's their home. If they're telling you there is a large spider, there probably is a large spider. Now, during a visit to Cameroon around November 2000, Gibbons reportedly spoke with a Baka chief named Timbo. And Timbo allegedly told him something rather extraordinary. He reckons a giant spider had built a nest near the village. Now think about that for the moment, because I would certainly move out of the village, right? If the story is accurately reported, this simply, my grandfather once saw a giant spider, or I was walking along the road and something walked in front of me or across a trail. This was a claim about a creature supposedly present in the area at the time of the investigation. And yet, nothing was captured. No spider was brought back. No specimen was collected. Now, let's go back, and yet nothing was captured. If you was that investigator, would you try capturing one? No spider was brought back. No specimen was collected. No photograph conclusively demonstrating the creature was obtained. But again, if you was the investigator, would you try and get a photo of a 5-foot spider? I'm not saying that's the case, but you've got to consider it, right? The evidence remained testimony, but the story didn't stop there. According to later accounts by 2003, Baka informants reportedly said that the J'ba Fofi has become even rarer. And they reportedly mentioned another sighting in June 2003. Now we have something fascinating. We still don't have no proof, but we do have different incidences, don't we? We have a timeline. 1938, the Lloyd encounter. In 2000, a reported giant spider nest near a Baka village. So, different sightings, different times. More than 60 years separate the famous Western encounter from the later accounts. So there are different accounts and different sightings. And that raises an obvious question. If the J'ba Fofi is simply a legend, why were people still describing it as a living creature? Now, descriptions vary. And that creates another problem. There is no official scientific description of the J'ba Fofi because there is no confirmed J'ba Fofi, is there? Right? It's all still legend. But the reoccurring descriptions paint a remarkably disturbing picture. Right? A large spider, usually brown, often described as hairy, resembling a giant tarantula. Some accounts again mention a purple or violet abdomen. The legs are long, the body is substantial, and the animal supposedly lives on or close to the forest floor. Some reports claim it constructs a shelter from leaves. Others describe large web positioned between trees. The alleged prey includes birds and small animals, and some accounts claim that the spider uses strands of webbing across game trails. Now imagine walking through the Congo forest, following a narrow animal path. You don't see a web because you're not looking for one. You don't hear anything. Then a strand catches your leg. This is a horror film, isn't it? You look down. Another strand is stretched across the trail, and then another. You follow the web with your eye. Just imagine. It leads towards the trees, and somewhere above you, something moves. That's the nightmare version of J'ba Fofi, isn't it? But now we have to ask the question that brings us back to reality. Well, this is the scientific question, right? Could a spider actually become that large? The largest spiders known to science are already impressive, aren't they? I would put I'm going to put a picture there, right? Oh, spiders, right? The Goliath bird eater can reach a leg span of 28 centimeters. That's roughly 11 inches. And then there are the giant huntsman spiders, which can also reach remarkable sizes. But a spider with a leg span of 3 feet? Well, that would be something totally different, wouldn't it? And a spider approaching 5 feet? Well, that would be extraordinary. The problem isn't simply size. Spiders have an exoskeleton. Their respiratory systems are adapted to their body size. Their muscles have to move their bodies. And as an animal becomes larger, its weight increases dramatically relative to the strength of its support and structures. So the J'ba Fofi isn't simply asking science to accept a slightly bigger spider, is it? You know, it's not like you're going into your shed and you're seeing a big spider. It's asking science to accept an animal dramatically outside the size range of known species. That doesn't automatically mean it's impossible, but it means the claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence is missing. Now, here's where things get strange, right? The Congo isn't the only place where people have reported enormous spiders. Now, these are scattered accounts from other parts of the world. I looked on the internet. Now, one frequently reported story comes from Papua New Guinea during the Second World War. According to the account, an Australian soldier on the Kakadua Trail encountered a spider described as roughly the size of a puppy. It was reportedly black, hairy and thick-bodied. It resembled a giant tarantula. The spider was said to be living around a large web. But once again, there is no specimen. No photograph. But once again, I will ask the question, if you saw that spider, would you try to capture it? If you saw that spider, would you try and take a photograph? Right, so no preserved body. Again, would you try and capture it? So we've only got the story. And then there is another account, this time from Louisiana in 1948. A man named William Sladen was reportedly walking with his grandchildren when they heard something moving in the vegetation. And a giant spider allegedly emerged and crossed the road. The spider was later described as being approximately the size of a washing machine. Then comes an alleged 1906 report from the Black Hills. A woman reportedly saw a giant spider crossing a remote road. Again, no specimen, no photograph, no physical evidence. But again, If you saw a giant spider crossing a remote road, would you try to chase it? Would you try to grab it? And would you try to photograph it? No, you wouldn't. You would stay there shocked and possibly ready to run in the opposite direction. And in 1970, an alleged account from Cambodia described a green beret encountering what he believed was an enormous spider while using night vision. The creature was reportedly enormous and then vanished into the forest. And at this point, we have to stop, right? Because this is where a good mystery can easily become a bad documentary. These accounts are not proof that giant spiders exist. For me, though, it makes me wonder. They're just reports. Some are several steps removed from the original witnesses. Some are poorly sourced. And some are almost impossible to independently verify. But they do raise an interesting question, right? Why do people keep reporting giant spiders? It makes you think, doesn't it? And now we come to one of the most strangest stories associated with the mystery. Now, a supposed account from the 1890s involving an English missionary named Arthur John Sims. Now, as in the region of Lake Nyasa, and I'll put the map up there, right? According to later cryptozoological retellings, members of his party became caught in an enormous web. According to the story, they were caught in an enormous web. Then, giant spiders allegedly emerged. The spiders were supposedly several feet across, and the men were attacked. And Paul Sims was allegedly bitten. Now, the story claims that he became extremely ill and eventually died. It sounds how horrifying, doesn't it, right? It also sounds exactly like the kind of story that will make a remarkably cryptical legend unforgettable because they were bitten, they were attacked, and someone died. But there is a problem with this one, right? The sourcing for the account is extremely weak. Modern searches repeatedly lead back to later cryptozoological retellings rather than a readily verifiable contemporary record, okay? Right? But where does the story come from? Every story has a beginning, right? Now, this was 1890. So the survivors may have ran back, documented it, and the documents got lost, right? But it is just a story. Even people investigating the J'ba Fofi online have questioned whether there is an independent evidence that the alleged Sims account can be authenticated. So I shouldn't tell my viewers in 1890 a missionary was killed by giant spiders, because that will be presenting an uncertain story as fact, shouldn't I? Instead, I should say there is a much older story attributed to the 1890s, but its historical foundations are extremely difficult to verify. And honestly, that makes the investigation more credible, because we're not trying to convince you, we're trying to find out what we actually know. There are several possibilities, aren't there? The first is misidentification. The Congo contains large spiders, that I do not doubt. A frightened person seeing a large spider close to the camera or at an unusual angle could dramatically overestimate its size. And then there is perspective. This is especially important, isn't it? If a spider is close to the observer while the tree behind it are far away, the brain can misjudge its dimensions. A spider doesn't need to be 3 foot across to look enormous. It only needs to be in the right place, at the right distance, and seen under right conditions. Then there is storytelling. A frightening encounter becomes a memorable story. The story gets repeated, doesn't it? Chinese whispers. Details becomes more dramatic. A large spider becomes a giant spider, and eventually the giant spider becomes a monster. And there is another possibility that the J'ba Fofi might represent several different animals rather than one species. It's a possibility, isn't it? A large tarantula, a huntsman, an unfamiliar forest spider, perhaps even something that isn't a spider at all. over generations, different observations could have emerged into one legendary creature. And then there is the possibility that something genuinely unusual exists. Not necessarily a 5-foot spider, but perhaps an unusually large or rare species that is yet to be properly documented. So let's give the mystery its strongest case, shall we? The Congo Basin is enormous. The Baka have traditional knowledge of the forest. There are accounts describing a large spider with surprisingly consistent characteristics. The Lloyd reportedly encountered a large spider in 1938. Later researchers were reportedly told that giant spiders still exist. In 2000, Timbo allegedly reported a J'ba Fofi nest near his village. Was he making that up? He probably wasn't. And in 2003, another alleged sighting was reported. These aren't all independent, scientifically documented sightings, but they do form a pattern. And perhaps the most intriguing part is the apparent rarity. If the creature was once common but has become rare, that could explain why modern researchers haven't found one, and we could blame that to deforestation, human expansion, changes to the forest, loss of habitat. Perhaps the creature disappeared decades ago. Perhaps only a tiny population survived. Or perhaps it never existed in the first place. Now, let's look at the other side. If a spider several feet across really lived in the Congo, where's the evidence? Where are the bodies? Where are the shed skins? Where are the egg sacs? Where are the unmistakable webs? Where are the photographs? Where are the remains of the prey? And most importantly, where is the spider? Modern biologically has discovered extraordinary creatures in remote environments, and they're still discovering them today. But discovering a new species isn't enough. A new species needs evidence, something physical, something that can be measured, something that can be examined by independent scientists. And the J'ba Fofi has none of that, not yet anyway. And that is the singlest biggest problem facing the legend. But let's imagine something, right? Not a 5-foot spider, not a monster, something slightly more realistic. Suppose there is an unusual spider living deep within the Congo Basin, and I don't doubt that for a moment. Perhaps it's much larger than the species currently known from the region. I don't doubt that either. Perhaps it does live underground. Perhaps it's nocturnal. Perhaps its population is tiny and it avoids humans. The animal could potentially survive for a very long time without being properly studied. And if someone saw it, they might describe it as enormous, especially if they have never encountered anything similar before. That is part of the mystery I find most interesting. We don't need a monster, do we? We only need really an animal, an unknown animal, one that hasn't been properly documented. But there is still a large gap between something unusual might exist, isn't there, and a 5-foot spider living in the Congo. And that gap is where cryptozoology often gets itself in trouble. Perhaps the most frightening thing about the J'ba Fofi isn't the spider. Perhaps it's the forest itself. Because the Congo doesn't need a monster to be terrifying, does it? It already contains predators. It already contains venomous creatures, disease, swamp, rivers, dense vegetation, and huge areas where a person could easily become completely lost. The forest is capable of hiding things, but hiding something doesn't mean that something is supernatural. And that is where the J'ba Fofi becomes such an interesting mystery. It sits directly on the boundaries between folklore and zoology, between eyewitnesses' testimony and scientific evidence, between something people believe and something we can prove. So, after all these years, is the J'ba Fofi real? Now, the honest answer is we don't know. There is a genuine cultural tradition concerning a great or giant spider that cannot be denied. There are historical and modern antidotes associated with enormous spiders, isn't there? The Lloyd story from 1938 remains one of the best known accounts. William Gibbon's research produced later reports from Baka informants, and they lived there. The Baka informants lived there, and there are scattered giant spider stories from elsewhere in the world, but none of them give us a specimen. None of it gives us a verified photograph. None of it gives us DNA. And none of it gives us a preserved body. And without that, the J'ba Fofi remains unconfirmed, doesn't it? But perhaps that's exactly why the story has survived, because the Congo is one of those places where the unknown still feels enormous, a place where the forest stretches beyond the horizon, a place where the darkness between the trees can conceal almost anything, and perhaps somewhere beneath those trees something is moving, something with 8 legs, something that has never been photographed, something that has never been brought into a laboratory, or perhaps there is nothing at all. Perhaps the J'ba Fofi is simply a story created by fear, a story passed from generation to generation, a story that grew larger every time it was told. And perhaps that's the real mystery. Not that, where is the giant spider, right? Not that, but how did the story become so powerful? What do you think? Because there is one thing we know for certain: the Congo rainforest is real. It does exist, doesn't it? The spiders are real. Well, the spiders we know of. The stories are real. The witnesses, at least some of them, believed that they had seen something extraordinary. But until someone walks out of that forest carrying something that we can examine, the J'ba Fofi remains exactly where it has always been, somewhere between the shadows and the truth. What do you think? And if you ever find yourself walking alone through the Congo rainforest and something brushes against your leg, don't look down too quickly. You might not like what you find. Well, this was UFO, aliens and weird stuff. I really appreciate you sticking around. What do you think of the giant spider story? Now, I am massively into aliens and UFOs, but I wanted to tell something weird. I actually found this story when I was listening to a podcast, and I found, mate, fascinating. Giant spiders, and I started looking into it a bit deeper, and the stories are everywhere. Now, if I was going to go into the Congo, and I'm never going to do that, right, and I spoke to the Baka people, and they said there are giant spiders, take it as gospel, because every good horror story starts with someone poo-pooing a story, doesn't it? Right, well, look, this was Alien, UFOs and Weird Stuff. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.